Actually, I've got a new list on the list of reasons why you should listen to this guy. Apparently, there's an ad running on Air America that describes me as a new gladiator for the progressive movement. And my wife listened to it and said, "Now you really need to lose some weight." Okay. So. Last time I had a book out, it was largely a collection of columns, and it was written in what I still think of as the darkest days of recent years. It was a period. The book came out in 2003. It was written. The various entries in it were mostly written in 2002 and in 2003, which was I assume for many people in this room, certainly for me, it was a kind of a nightmarish period. One of those nightmares where you're screaming and no one can hear you, which is particularly peculiar when you're writing twice a week on the op-ed page of the New York Times. But even so, it didn't seem like anything was getting through. To some extent, that nightmare has lifted. The acoustics in here are really interesting. It's all right. I'll save. I'm sorry. It is really strange because the echoing. By the way, the best news source truly for these past 7 years has in fact been The Onion, and my favorite of all the Onion stories was the one that explained everything, that basically Dick Cheney had been using the White House intercom system to talk to George Bush, pretending to be the voice of God. And that's what this room is making me think of right now. Sorry. Okay. So let me get back to the theme. All right. Things have lifted some. There's clearly a lot more hope. And actually, this new book, The Conscience of a Liberal, is remarkably optimistic at the end for me. So much so that friends are asking if I'm feeling quite all right. So I'll try to talk about the reasons for that optimism and also the reasons to be really worried about the outlook. But mostly, we have 15 long months of this administration to go. By no means assured that we're going to have a good administration to follow, but it does seem that we need to look beyond. We need to get past what happened, and we need to figure out where we can be going from here. But in order to understand that, we need to understand how we got here in the first place. So a large part of Conscience of a Liberal is about what brought us to this nightmare that we all felt we were living in for several years, and that turns out that when you look at that history, there are some reasons for guarded optimism, for thinking that we may be able to turn this around, but not necessarily. So before I get to the future, let me tell you what I think we need to know about the past. Now, there are, from my point of view, two great puzzles in what happened to America over the past several decades. One of them is economic. It's the puzzle of why it is that we've come to enter a second Gilded Age. What happened to the middle-class society? I'm a baby boomer. What happened to the middle-class society that baby boomers grew up in, the middle-class society of post-war America? How is it that inequality has increased as much as it has? And the second puzzle is political. How is it that, far from doing something to mitigate this movement into a second Gilded Age, in fact, the political system has egged it on, has, in fact, as I'll explain in a little bit, largely been responsible for the creation of a second Gilded Age. We're supposed to be a democracy. Shouldn't changes in economic trends that hurt most people and benefit only a small number of people evoke a reaction, and not a reaction of approval and encouragement? So those are the two great puzzles, and let me talk first about the economics. So, all right, I'm saying second Gilded Age, and people tend to think, well, that's exaggeration, it's hyperbole, it's a metaphor. It's none of that. And the cold, hard numbers tell you that it's, in fact, not at all an exaggeration. Right now, the inequality of incomes in the United States is approximately as great as it was. Actually, it's almost exactly matches the numbers from the 1920s. And there, as far as we can tell, the 1920s were not really that different from the 1890s. So, in fact, when we say we're in a second Gilded Age, that's literally true. We are fully back to levels of inequality as great. You can see it, not just in the statistics, but, for example, Greenwich, Connecticut was like the North Shore of Long Island, which is near where I grew up, but Greenwich, Connecticut was one of the great places of robber baron mansions. There were giant mansions in Greenwich, Connecticut built during the Gilded Age. And during the post-war era, many of them were converted into nursing homes. Basically, no one could afford to maintain houses like that in the America I thought I was living in. In recent years, people, mostly hedge fund managers, have been buying up those Gilded Age mansions in Greenwich, and in many cases tearing them down to build bigger mansions. So we are, it really has happened. We really are back to the full Gilded Age. This has some pretty serious consequences. In a way, the least of those consequences, but very important, is that most Americans are not sharing in economic progress, or sharing very little in it. There is a real debate, a complex debate among economists about whether the typical family is better off now than it was in the early 1970s. By some measures, income adjusted for inflation is up a little bit, but that's entirely because more working spouses. So how much of that is a real gain, and how much of it is just people working harder? Then you can go through other things. Some things, there were no DVD players in 1973. There were, but on another hand, it was easier to get to feel that your children were getting a decent education in 1973. The inequality in school districts has increased greatly. You can put it around. The answer is not important, actually. What's amazing is that we're having that debate. The fact that it's even debatable whether the typical family has made any gains over the past 35 years is incredible, because think of what America was like in 1973. Think of what the economy was like. No personal computers, no internet, no fax machines except very expensive things that were used by news organizations. No barcode scanners in the supermarkets. Freighters were unloaded by guys holding big bags of stuff, no freight containerization. We're an enormously richer country, enormously more productive country than we were 35 years ago. Yet we're not sure that the typical family has gained anything. And the reason, of course, is that all or nearly all of the gains went to a few people at the top. Now, who are these people? There's a widespread tendency to say, well, it's all about education. And it's people with good educations who've done well, and people without have not. Which turns out to be not entirely wrong, but mostly wrong. That is, it is true that people with college educations have done better than people with only a high school degree. It's a significant difference. But the really big gains have come from only a small number of people. It's not that your typical college educated or even your typical postgraduate education person has done really, really well. In fact, even people with postgraduate degrees have done less well in the past 35 years than the typical person did in the previous 35 years. The real gains are very much at the top. And I could give you statistics on the soaring incomes of the top 1%, or the top tenth of a percent. By the way, top 1% is $350,000 a year up. Top tenth of a percent is about 1 million a year up. So those are the groups that have really done well, especially that top tenth of a percent. But there's one statistic I like that really highlights just how narrowly based the gains have been. High school teachers actually are quite highly educated. They normally have a master's degree, at least. So they're actually quite highly educated. Hedge fund managers are also quite highly educated. They normally have an MBA, in some cases a PhD, but generally speaking, not that different in level of education from high school teachers. High school teachers and hedge fund managers have not exactly had the same growth in income over the past 35 years. In fact, last year, the highest paid hedge fund manager, one guy, earned as much as all 80,000 school teachers in New York. So it's, very, very narrowly based gains. hedge fund managers, CEOs, high executives. How did that happen? Well, it still could be. Now, the simple explanation that the world demands more skill and higher education, that can't be right because most educated people haven't done all that well. It could be other kinds of technological, well, we can think of things that might have happened. But there's a lot of reason to believe that there's a very, very strong political component in the increase in inequality. How do we know that? First, we know that middle-class society, the middle-class society of the post-war years, was a political creation. It didn't happen gradually. We didn't gradually evolve from the era of J.P. Morgan to the era of Ozzie and Harriet, of middle-class America. It happened in just a very few years, from the late 1930s through to the middle of the 1940s. The economic historians call it the Great Compression. It was achieved politically by the New Deal. It was a combination of policies: Social Security, unemployment insurance, minimum wage, pro-labor organizing policies, progressive taxation, high corporate taxation. All of these things, Great Compression, play on Great Depression, of course, but it compressed the differences in income among different groups. It was basically an act of political will, made possible by an extraordinary situation of the country. Two important things about that. One is that it persisted. You might have thought that particularly the wartime environment, which made it possible to impose a lot more equality on America, once that was over, that you would have gone back to business as usual. But it turns out, for about 30 years, the new equality persisted. What that's suggesting is that institutions, norms, people's idea of what's appropriate play a big role in what wages are and how profits are divided between owners and the workers in a firm. Basically, all of that it's not nearly as much an automatic invisible hand, if you're an economist, process as we like to imagine. There's a very strong element of what people consider normal and acceptable. The other thing is, a lot of people will tell you, well, any attempt to really reduce income differentials is disastrous for the economy. But the post-war generation was, in fact, an era of spectacular economic growth. It was the best 25 years the United States or any economy has ever had, all in an environment of relative middle-classness. Now, it came apart beginning in the late 1970s. Big increase in inequality. How did that happen? Well, one thing you need to know is actually that the second Gilded Age is uniquely American. There are a lot of other advanced countries. They all face the same technological changes, the same globalization that we do, but only the United States has this extraordinary reappearance of a tiny, extremely wealthy elite. You can see bits of it elsewhere. There is a little bit of it in Britain, although most of the increase in inequality in Britain took place during the Thatcher years, which again is telling you something about politics. But elsewhere, not at all. It's just an American thing. What went on? Well, there are many things. Of course, I wrote large parts of a book about it, but I give you one, I think, really telling example. The decline of unions is a very important part of the U.S. story. Not just because of the direct effects that unions have on raising and equalizing the wages of their workers, of their members, but because unions have a tendency to set norms for the society as a whole. Again, the economic historians actually call the period of relative equality in the U.S. the Treaty of Detroit, because the norms set by the United Auto Workers under Walter Reuther, when it was a very powerful institution, tended to really be echoed not just by other unions, but even in non-union industries, because the non-union industries didn't want to give grounds for the formation of a union. And unions also they're a political counterweight, both in politics proper and in things that are implicitly political. CEOs have always appointed the committee that decides how much the CEO ought to be paid. So in a fundamental sense, CEOs have always set their own wages. And yet, in the 1960s, those committees set wages at only 30 times the wages of the average worker. Now it's about 350 times. What happened? Well, one thing that happened is that there were, in fact, this is what people on both sides of the debate about CEO pay will tell you there used to be constraints, what's known in the academic literature as the outrage constraint. There would be people who would start jumping up and down if a CEO engaged in gross self-dealing. Unions were an important part of that. So were politicians who would hold hearings, but part of the reason politicians held hearings was that there was an effective labor movement that sort of demanded that. So all of these things affect. All right. So the decline of unions is a big issue, but hey, unions, as everybody knows, they're just outmoded. They don't really have a role in the 21st century economy, except that the decline of unions is uniquely American. In the 1960s, Canada and the United States both had about 30% of their workers in unions. Canada still has nearly 30% of its workers in unions. The United States is down to 11, and if you take out the public sector, it's down to less than 8 in the private sector. What happened? How come we don't have a union movement anymore except in a very few places? The answer is politics. Above all, politics during the Reagan era, but persisting to this day. Reagan, in effect, declared open season on unions. Employers felt that they could get away with union busting, and they did. Not so much busting existing unions, although they did some of that, but primarily doing whatever was necessary to stop unions from spreading to new sectors as the economy changed. So that during the 1980s, at least 1 in every 20 workers who voted for a union was illegally fired. Now, well, not to put too fine a point on it, why is Walmart not unionized? Giant company, large enterprise, fits all of the normal criteria for something that would make a natural target for unionization. Doesn't face international competition. You can't make that argument. You can't go to China to do your shopping. Why isn't Walmart unionized? Well, because Walmart grew big in a political environment in which companies like Walmart were able to block union organizing by any means they chose. All of these things explain why the United States has become so unequal and so much more unequal than other advanced countries. That doesn't explain the political environment. So how did that happen? Well, it's a two-part story. And one part is the rise of what I call in the book, but it's not my term, movement conservatism. The people who actually call it that are the conservatives themselves. They'll ask, are you part of the movement? They'll even say, are you a movement conservative? Movement conservatism, yes, Virginia, there is a vast right-wing conspiracy. But it's not hidden. It's not as if for all I know, maybe there is a secret star chamber someplace, but that's not what's important. What really matters is that there's an open set of institutions that behave cooperatively, collusively, with an essentially unequalizing economic agenda. The institutions range all the way from the Heritage Foundation to Fox News. The goals, particularly if you look at the fundraising letters that the Heritage Foundation sets out, they're really quite straightforward. The Heritage says, don't forget that ultimately the aim is to undo the Great Society and the New Deal, to undo Medicare, Social Security, all of the things that happened. One member of the vast right-wing conspiracy that happens to be eminently quotable is a fellow you may have heard of named Grover Norquist, head of Americans for Tax Action. And someone said that actually the good thing about Norquist is he's actually kind of like a James Bond villain who explains his evil plans to his and so he's most famous for the remark about wanting to shrink the government down to the size where he could drown it in the bathtub. But the one I really think is better. So I asked, how does he think America should be? And he says he wants it to be back the way it was before Teddy Roosevelt and the socialists came in. So back before, basically the whole, not just the New Deal, but the progressive era too. Get rid of the whole work. It's coordinated the glue that holds it together. It's coordinated the glue that holds it together is money. Look at the institutions of movement conservatism, look at the funding sources, and you will again and again find the same 5 family foundations as key funders. Richard Mellon Scaife, Coors, Koch, Smith Richardson, Bradley, a couple of others that also make appearances. So it really is, I've always thought that the right-wing paranoia about George Soros Although partly it's looking for a boogeyman, it's partly a little bit of tacit anti-Semitism and all the other things, but partly the idea that an evil billionaire is coordinating everything makes sense to them, because after all, that is the way things work on their side of the fence. Beyond, so that's what holds the institutions together. Why is it able to dominate the Republican Party? Because that's again part of it. Why has this movement been able to dominate one of America's two great political parties? It did not in the past, right? When we go back to the 50s, to Eisenhower. People don't know, but when Eisenhower was president, the top tax rate was 91%. Eisenhower wrote a letter to his brother about people who thought you could do away with Social Security and other New Deal policies. And he said, they are a tiny minority and they are stupid. But that was then. Now, it's an entirely different party now. The domination of the party comes because, primarily, there are very strong incentives for politicians to toe the line, and very strong penalties if they don't. Consider two Republicans who both lost their Senate seats last year. Lincoln Chafee was maybe the last moderate Republican. He faced an extremely well-funded primary challenge from the Club for Growth, which is basically a tax cut enforcement organization. Actually, they say it themselves: we are the enforcers of tax cut policy. Even though Republicans knew very well they might need his seat to keep the Senate. And then when he lost his seat, he was, there was nothing. The movement was certainly not going to take care of him. He got last I heard, a one-year teaching appointment at Brown. Rick Santorum. Rick Santorum very much at the core of the whole thing. Rick Santorum there was a weekly meeting that, have you ever heard of the K Street Project? Basically trying to make sure that all of the lobbying organizations were controlled by loyal Republicans. And Rick Santorum coordinated the Senate side of the K Street Project. He lost very badly because Pennsylvania really isn't that kind of state, certainly not now. But he himself was just fine. A right-wing think tank created a new program for the America's Enemies program and appointed him to head it. And so there's this, what friends of mine call wingnut welfare. There is a safety net. All right, this is how, and you can enlarge this much more widely. But of course, it doesn't work unless you can win elections. So how do you win elections when your fundamental ideology is cut taxes on the rich and try to undermine Social Security and Medicare and unemployment insurance? The answer, of course, is change the subject. So I have a chapter in the book titled "Weapons of Mass Distraction." In some ways, the 2004. In some ways, but missing one element, I think. The 2004 election was actually a classic because what you always need to understand is that what management is interested in, if you like, on the right, is economics. The goals are always about changes in economic policy that would essentially increase inequality. But the way they win elections is by running on something else. So in 2004, Bush runs as America's defender against gay married terrorists. And no sooner is the election over than he says, and now our first priority is privatizing Social Security. And there was a sort of a collective reaction from many of the people who voted for him of, what? We know that wasn't in the, but that's almost a perfect illustration, but not quite a perfect illustration, because actually those are not the issues that have, for the most part, won elections for the right. 2002 and 2004 were national security elections. Moral values, the religious right, played some role, crucially in mobilizing voters in tight races in a few states. But those are not that's not actually been the consistent source of advantage. The consistent source of advantage has been America's original sin, race. That just is what it's. I didn't actually think when I started working on the research for this book that's how it would come out. But once you start to look in earnest at the voting data, start to look in earnest at the political science studies, The centrality of race to the whole story is just overwhelming. So, give you a couple of numbers. That's always a risk I have. My background leads me to want to shower you with statistics, but I'll just give you two numbers. The first is, what has led to the flight of white males from the Democratic Party? And we all know that white men have left the Democratic Party, and every pundit can tell you why, as the Democrats seem weak on defense, and they're weak on moral values, and they haven't honored the, and so on down the list. Except, none of it is true. Because if you take out the South, nothing has happened. In 1952, 40% of non-Southern white males voted Democratic. In 2004, 39% of non-Southern white males voted Democratic. There is actually essentially no change once you take out the South. And why did the South switch? Well, it switched because after the Civil Rights Movement, Richard Nixon initiated the Southern strategy of winning over Southern whites. And in last year's election, Southern whites were the only large demographic group that voted heavily Republican. Every other group was either evenly split or voted heavily Democratic. Congress. After the 1954 election, the Democrats had a 30-seat majority in the House of Representatives. After the 2004 election, the Republicans had a 30-seat majority in the House of Representatives, which was the biggest majority they ever had, by the way, during their 12 years of control. How much of that was because the South switched parties? The answer is more than all of it. The Republicans had actually lost seats in the North over that 50-year span. So it was, again, entirely the Southern switch. Now, maybe the South switched for other reasons. Well, judging by the behavior of the politicians, they thought that race is what it's about. So, all right, let's talk about Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan is, in many ways, the essential figure for understanding what happened to America. But you can't understand that without, facing up to the fact that that St. Ronald Reagan, the patron saint of pure conservatism, is an imaginary figure. The real Ronald Reagan was a much less pleasant character. He was mean-spirited. The speech that made Reagan a national figure was a speech he gave for Barry Goldwater in 1964. And it's an amazing thing to read. He makes fun of John F. Kennedy for having said that millions of Americans go to bed hungry each night. And Reagan says, they were probably all on a diet. It's full of, there's a sort of early version of his later story about the welfare queen driving her Cadillac. This one is not quite the same story, but it's, again, it's, no completely unverified, almost certainly untrue, but this, again, this kind of thing. And there's a strong element, basically, of tacit race baiting. And that runs through Reagan's career, at least up to the point when he reaches the White House. And in the 1980 campaign, Reagan's first speech on the campaign trail was not about tax cuts. It was not about fighting communism. He went to Philadelphia, Mississippi, where the 3 civil rights workers had been murdered, and gave a speech about states' rights. Now, nothing explicit there, but it was a clear shout-out to racial prejudice. And it's, the same thing can be said of politicians we don't think of as being, we now look back at George H.W. Bush with some nostalgia. And the truth is he did govern in a fairly moderate fashion. But he ran the 1988 campaign very largely on Willie Horton. So this has been central to the whole way the politics has been run. This is a happy book. And it's a happy book because I think their run is just about over. That Movement Conservatives' run is just about over. So let me give you some reasons for optimism. The first is just that we are a more diverse country. We really are not. The electorate is less white. Now, what defines being white? The answer is, well, it basically depends on what the bigots think is white. And from the point of view of the core conservative base. Hispanic immigrants and their children and Asian immigrants and their children are not white. And by and large, the immigrants and their children understand that. And so you look, and there are these rapidly growing voting shares of the electorate that are not as solidly Democratic as African Americans, but getting there. And that in itself is a big change. Much more uplifting, I think, than just sort of the mechanical shift of the composition of the electorate is the fact that we are a better country, less racist. By no means over it, a long way from that, but less so. I thought the defining moment of the 2006 campaign was Macaca. George Allen, who was being widely talked about as a future Republican presidential nominee, is campaigning in Virginia, and there's a young American man of South Asian descent and who's videotaping him for the other campaign. And he starts insulting him with what turns out to be an obscure racial insult. That's not unusual. In American political history, that's not unusual at all. That's been, stapled. But what's different is that now that Virginia won't stand for it. That's enough to lose an election. And you can see there's lots of evidence from polling and just from the way people behave that racism, though by no means gone, is much diminished, which means that the core issue on which the right has been able to win elections is losing its force. It's a pretty good chance that progressive politicians will win elections, will win next year, will win elections, and several other elections. What do they do? What should they do with those election wins? Well, a lot of things, but the core issue for both immediate, just doing good for the public reasons, and for longer-term political reasons is health care. I talk a lot about, in the column and in the book, about health care reform. I think it's a moral imperative. Rich countries don't let their citizens go without necessary medical care because they can't afford it. They don't let them be financially ruined by the cost of medical care. No other wealthy nation does this except the United States. And you could say, well, it's too expensive, except it actually turns out that comprehensive universal health care is cheaper to run than a system in which insurance companies spend a lot of money trying to figure out who really needs health insurance so as not to give it to them. That's literally true. Medicare, which covers everybody 65 and older, spends 3% of its budget on overhead. Private insurance companies spend 14%. And that doesn't count all of the costs that are imposed on doctors and hospitals by trying to deal with insurance companies and their denials and so on. Other countries have healthcare systems, the best of them, France, Germany, are better than the U.S. on every dimension, and yet cost far less than ours. So this can be done. We know how to do it, and we actually have reasonable political strategies for getting it done. Ideally, people ask, don't you believe that single-payer Medicare for all is the way to go? And the answer is yes. In terms of the actual economics, that is what we can do. And by the way, you hear people say Americans will never go for a single-payer system, and yet every American 65 and older is actually covered by a single-payer system called Medicare. There's the famous story among healthcare policy types of the constituent who started shouting at a senator, "Senator, don't let the government get its hands on Medicare." So people don't. So we can do this with the enormous benefit. There's something else. So here I want to talk about how much I agree with William Kristol of the Weekly Standard. During the failed attempt by the Clintons to get a health care plan in the early 90s, Kristol wrote a memo to Republicans, now famous memo if you're in this area, saying our goal is not to improve this plan, it is to kill it. And the reason, he said, was because if the Democrats do succeed in getting a health care plan in any way, shape, or form, it will reinvigorate the New Deal agenda. It will reinvigorate. And he was right. So if we can get this, it would be an enormous demonstration that that government can be a force for good, that we can actually do things to make people's lives less risky, less brutal, that we can make this a better, fairer country. A lot depends on... The possibilities are incredibly good compared to where they seemed not long ago. I mean, it was in the spring of 2005, it felt as if, I mean, look, the conventional wisdom was that George Bush was going to succeed in basically dismantling Social Security. Now, all of the leading Democratic candidates are proposing serious, pretty reasonable chance of passing plans for universal health care. That's amazing. That's, you know, sometimes I have to pinch myself to believe that we've made that much progress, but it's by no means guaranteed. I have been sick on the road, and my apologies for this. It will get, it sounds worse than it is. My wife now has the horrible cold that I had for the last several days, so, or that was a message from God or Dick Cheney or somebody not to talk about this. Anyway, the chances are, you know, it's very good, but of course it can go wrong. The best hope, I think, is that we really do have a progressive movement in America now, in a way we did not 10 years ago. Certainly we did not 15 years ago. One of the things that strikes me looking back at the Clinton failure in the early 90s was that there really was no one behind Clinton to say, this is what you have to do, and get moving. Lyndon Johnson signed Medicare on July 30th, 1965. In other words, came into office in January and had this thing done by July. Bill Clinton gave his first speech on health care in September 1993. Just slow start and no cohesion. And this time there's enormously more cohesion, much more sense that things have to be done. But they could let us down. So I'll just close and say, I read a lot in this book about a whole chapter devoted to what I call the long Gilded Age, the period of great inequality that really persisted right up until the 1930s. And there were two parties, and sometimes there were seriously populist Democrats, although they were very flawed in a way. But often the Democrats were, and certainly the only Democrat who got elected to the White House during the Gilded Age proper, Grover Cleveland, they were what people at the time called Bourbon Democrats. They were, as in the French royal family, they were maybe a little more honest and competent than the other side, but they were almost as totally in the pocket of the robber barons. We have our Bourbon Democrats today. I'm actually trying to come up with hedge fund Democrats. Anyway, and there is a real concern about whether they'll deliver. I wrote in the Times a couple of weeks back, we hope we're about to elect another FDR. We might be about to elect another Grover Cleveland. But keep their feet to the fire. And I think there's, as I say, I'm still astonished. Maybe it was just because it was so bad a few years ago. Been down so long it feels like up from. But I think that the prospects, the hopes for turning this country around are better than they ever were. And above all, the fact that we got through those years. There was a point when it really seemed as if a new McCarthy era was coming, as if we were really on the brink. And I think we were, but we didn't, because Americans, the public, was better, more tolerant, more reasonable. I guess my bottom line on the experience of the last 7 years is that it has been horrible, but in the end this has turned out to be the country I hoped it was. Thanks.
You've been listening to economist, author, and New York Times columnist Paul Krugman speaking about his latest book, The Conscience of a Liberal. In a moment, we'll turn to questions from the audience. Paul Krugman spoke at the Baghdad Theater in Portland, Oregon on November 3, 2007. Paul Krugman's other books include The Great Unraveling, Losing Our Way in the New Century, Peddling Prosperity, Economic Sense and Nonsense in an Age of Diminished Expectations, and and, with co-author Maurice Obstfeld, International Economics, Theory and Policy. You can find out more about Paul Krugman and his work by visiting the unofficial Paul Krugman archive at www.pkarchive.org. And now we return to Paul Krugman, answering questions from the audience and continuing to discuss his latest book, The Conscience of a Liberal.
Okay, I guess I'll begin. I've been trying for some time to understand the conservative mind, the things that they seem to try to be doing in the country seem insane somehow, but I'm sure that they don't seem insane to them. And so my question is, what do you think a true conservative would tell us are their goals if he was really being honest with us? You've pointed out how many times they say one thing about their goals, but really something else is going on. How would they defend themselves?
Okay, that's a really good question. And I mean, this is why, by the way, we like Grover Norquist. He's evil but honest, I think is the correct description. No, there is a really strong nostalgia. It's kind of odd because it's nostalgia for an era nobody living remembers. But there's this real nostalgia for the Gilded Age. Look, one of the things you really need to do when listening, especially to George Bush, is understand that he does a lot of what, it's a wonderful phrase from the British, dog whistle politics. You can't hear it, but they can, is what they mean. So, and a lot of it is dog whistle politics to the religious right. So when Bush was, the slightly stilted language he was using after 9/11 about evildoers and all that, it just sounded kind of weird to most of us, but actually was fraught with meaning to real sort of end of times people on the religious right. But the one that's really amazing, because it's not very hard to figure out what he was really saying, is the phrase compassionate conservatism. What's that? And everybody still thinks he meant, well, I'm not going to try and I'm not going to try and undermine S-chip or something like that. So I'm a compassionate conservative. It was actually a shout-out to the religious right, drawing on especially the work of a Christian right author named Marvin Olasky. It was a book called The Tragedy of Compassion. And what that book is really arguing is that we need to go back to the days when there was no guaranteed government aid for the poor, and the poor had to go to private charities, especially religious charities, which would only give money to them if they were morally worthy. Because that was true compassion, as opposed to just, like giving people food when they're hungry. So the real vision is of a return to the age of no safety net, and because they think that would be a morally better society. That it would be better for the poor and better for the rich, who would be morally ennobled by giving charity. Of course, somehow also along the way, you get much lower taxes on rich people and all of that, so, and cheaper labor. So there's another side to it. But I think that's the answer. It's just it's a view that's so far out from what most people would accept if it was actually raised in an election that you could never run on that. But that is what's lurking there, and occasionally it just pops through. Sometimes you'll just see an opinion piece written by some apparatchik of the conservative movement, and they'll slip up, and this basic view that harsher is better, and that a society in which people who don't measure up to the standards for requiring aid just starve or die from lack of medical care is a better one. Anyway, amazing stuff. Go ahead.
Hi. I want to thank you for your column in the New York Times. I really appreciate reading that, and I'm so excited that you're here.
Thank you.
A question about access to information, and it's funny because I read your editorial in the New York Times for information, and you'd think you'd read it on the front page of the paper, but I go to your column and I'll find, I didn't know that the death toll of who's dying in Iraq is changed by whether they're shot head on or in the back.
Yeah.
So I wonder, how do we get more access to information? And it just seems like there's fewer and fewer, the control of the media is into fewer and fewer hands. And how, I'm so excited that you are able to talk about what you do, but you're sort of in an institution, and there's a lot of people who get fired for saying things like you say. And so, there's two things that I'm really concerned about, and one is the role of the military-industrial complex and the role that they play in our economy. The other is the separation of corporation and state. I think that this country is separated church and state, but corporation and state are so interconnected. And I don't know how we make it so that more people have access to more information.
Yeah, okay. I'm tempted to follow all of the lines in that, and it probably is. But let me no, because the whole bunch of things. I mean, one thing we might want to point out is that just to say it, the corporate influence, although large, is actually one of the odd things is how many of the really big beneficiaries of cronyism in this administration have not been established corporations, but just sort of people with the right connections. So Blackwater was a two-bit operation until suddenly it became the prime provider of mercenaries for these wars, and the whole idea, that's another thing. It's just, this bringing us back. I mean, if Grover Norquist wants to bring us back to the 19th century, mercenaries sort of went out in the 17th century, and now we're doing it anyway. The media, information. Okay, in some ways, information is, for those who are prepared to do a little work, more available than ever, thanks to the internet. During the darkest days here, when there really was a muzzle draped over a lot of coverage, you could still read British Canadian newspapers and learn a lot of things that were barely being reported here. Or you could read, one of the odd things during the Iraq buildup was that a lower prestige news organization, Knight Ridder, now McClatchy, was giving very accurate reporting that somehow wasn't showing up in the Washington Post or the New York Times. So it was, and because of the internet, you can read it. There is no McClatchy newspaper where I live, but you can read it anyway. How it reaches the public is another problem. And this is something that is a great concern to me. And I've been written about many times, and I try, with my limited, despite the prominence of the podium, there's only so much you can do, but I try and do a little bit of bullying on the media, just get stuff out. During the 2004 campaign, I tried to, most people still get their news from TV, and I actually tried to figure out what somebody getting his news from TV would have known about the healthcare plans of the candidates. And the answer was nothing, not a thing. There were stories occasionally about how the plans were playing politically, but nothing about what was actually in them. And there's just a new study by Pew of campaign coverage so far this year. And if anything, it's gotten worse. There's hardly any stories about what is substantively being proposed. And everything's about horse race or fundraising or supposedly revealing personal anecdotes, and it's a real problem. Particularly the refusal to call out when candidates say something that's just wrong, just false, persists. We're now actually, Thursday was the 7th anniversary of the column I wrote where I said that if Bush said that the Earth was flat, the headline would read, "Opinions differ on shape of planet." Well, sure enough, we have. But wait, sure enough, we had just, if you read me yesterday, we have Rudy Giuliani making a completely false claim about prostate cancer treatment. And the headlines, for the most part, read, Giuliani's statements on prostate cancer in dispute. Now, they're not in dispute. They're false. But you can't get people to report that. And it's, so we have, it's a real problem. It's one of the things that really worries me. I mean, if... people talk, taking the case of Rudy Giuliani, people say, well, it's funny, New Yorkers actually hate him, but somehow most of the country hasn't heard the stories that everyone in New York knows about him. And these are people from the media, and we're saying, well, they don't know them because you guys aren't reporting them. So anyway, No, it's a very big problem. Now, the public is sometimes, the public is smarter than it's often given credit for. Take the simple question, do you believe we were deliberately misled into war with Iraq? The public reached that conclusion by, polls started showing the majority of the public believed that long before it was acceptable even to say it in Washington. Long before. I don't even know if anybody on the Sunday talk shows is sort of allowed to say that. But the public reached that conclusion by early 2005. So, there is some reason to have faith in the American people, but it does make me very nervous.
Thank you. As a boomer of 49 years, naively believed that the middle class wouldn't ever be on the endangered species list.
Yeah.
And you talk about this second Gilded Age, and I wonder, in your view as an economist, how things might be different in terms of how we pull ourselves out, because since then we've had the global economy, we've had trade policies and changes such that offshore corporations, manufacturing is now offshore, things that have changed that the way that we can tax our corporations may be more limited. I'm just wondering how we are going to build our economic base once again, and other than just with the new industry build up through the healthcare industry, for example.
Well, okay, but that's good. All right, now, we're never going to be an economy centered on manufacturing, because even if we had eliminated the trade deficit, even if we were, fully self-sufficient in manufactured goods, there would still be mostly a non-manufacturing economy, because we've gotten much more efficient at producing manufactured goods. What people buy increasingly consists of services. It's just that's inherent in the changes in the economy. It's just like farmers. Nothing you can do is going to turn us back into being a nation of farmers, because we don't need that many farmers. Now we don't need that many industrial workers. The big mistake that people make is in believing that good jobs have to be in manufacturing. That's an illusion created by the fact that the decline of manufacturing came along with an era of union busting and growing inequality, but it doesn't have to be that way. In fact, it isn't that way in other advanced countries. There are a lot, service sector jobs pay much better in much of the world than they do here. Come back to think about what a unionized Walmart would look like. It would be significantly higher wages. I'd say it would have health benefits, but if we had universal health care, everyone would have health benefits. It just would be much closer to being middle-class employment. Healthcare is a perfect example. Healthcare is now huge. It is now either, depending on how you cut the numbers, healthcare is now bigger as an employer than manufacturing. There's no reason why healthcare jobs should be low-wage jobs. Some of them, of course, are extraordinarily high-wage jobs, but even the basic nursing jobs and so on should be middle-class jobs. I think that the bottom line is that we are a rich country. And there are ways to make sure that wealth gets widely shared. Other countries that face the same global economy we do still have a strong middle class. Even Canada, which has problems, it's a much alternate polarized, unequal society than ours is. The Scandinavians do very well at this, and although everybody trashes the French. It turns out that the French economy is a lot better than people, it had problems, they really screwed up their retirement policy, but it's a lot better. So there's a big, there's a divide among people who are on the progressive side of the political spectrum about trade policy. And I've been pro-globalization, mostly not for the United States, but because I think it's terribly important for the world's poor countries to have open markets. But then the question is, well, what about the U.S.? And basically, I think it's something we can have a reasonable discussion about, and we can look for ways to make trade fairer, and we can do things. I don't know if people here read Eric Alterman and all, but we actually had a sort of open discussion. This came up, and we were talking. We disagree on trade policy, and 10 years ago, those disagreements seemed like a big thing. And we actually agreed. I don't know who came up with the metaphor, he or I, but we both agreed on it, that while we were arguing about trade policy, Sauron was gathering his forces in Mordor, and that seems sort of more important at this point. So you know, I'm broadly pro-globalization, but not religiously so. Other people, I look at somebody like Sherrod Brown in Ohio, who's much more protectionist than I am, but I'm willing to discuss and bridge that gap, and I don't think that's the core of it. You know, give me universal health care, give me change in labor laws, give me a stronger earned income tax credit, give me stronger aid to families with children, and I think then we can talk along the way about whether we want to. You know, we're not going to have any new free trade agreements for a long time to come, and that's okay with me. And we probably are going to be looking for new ways to include labor standards in our existing agreements, and that's fine, though I think it'll do less than people imagine, but I'm willing to go with it. And we'll see from there. But you can have a middle-class society in a global economy. Every other advanced country is managing it, so we should be able to do it too.
If you and your other colleague, columnist David Brooks, are up here on the stage together chatting about some of these same subjects, how might the conversation go?
I have no idea. To be honest, you know, I've only actually met David once. It's an interesting thing. You think we're all sitting there around, and it's not true. He's DC based. I'm Central New Jersey based, and so I mean, it's an interesting thing. I think. Trying to think about what I ought not to say. He's writing very interesting sociological pieces these days, which leads me to believe that I'm winning the economic arguments.
I'm going to come back to another unhappy subject, and that is the war and the cost of the war.
Yeah.
It may be that we're all talked out about it, but one of the things I love the most about your column is the way you can quantify using real data to put perspective on things. And you haven't talked about it much today, but as an economist myself, I can't even imagine the cost of the war, even the direct cost of the war. And if you could say something about how we can cut that cost after the next election, or will it just go on forever?
Okay. Start with the end of that first. This is completely, you know, I know no more than anyone else about what the next president will do. But my guess is that any Democrat will in fact get us out fairly quickly. That all of the cautious talk about it is not because any of them has any desire to stay in, but because because Democrats are so far ahead on every issue except national security, which is roughly tied, that they don't even want to, you know, make that the centerpiece of the campaign. The cost of the war. Look, it's enormous in absolute terms. It's enormous relative to quite pressing social needs. So the proposed S-chip expansion on healthcare for 5 years is 41 days in Iraq. That said, and the numbers, you know, we're looking probably, when all is said and done, at $2 trillion, even if we have a pretty quick phase down. Okay, so you want to have some sense, though, it's relative to the scale of the U.S. economy. So we're spending at this point around 1% of GDP, or a little bit less, on Iraq. We were spending more than 2% of GDP on Vietnam. During the Cold War, the military budget was 10% of GDP, the height of the Cold War. So we're talking about something that, in relative terms, is still not a crushing burden. It's sure significant. If we get rid of it, it helps free up money that can be used for health care, for poverty assistance, for, you know, but it's not in itself a crippling burden. Even, you know, the debt from it won't be a crippling burden. So it's, you know, some perspective. The other costs of the war, the non-monetary ones, those are frightening to contemplate. You know, and I look at in some sense, I have a feeling that nothing I'm saying today matters compared with the prospect that a nuclear armed Pakistan may be about to blow up on us. But, it's but the cost in American reputation, the idea that from the defenders of freedom we become the perpetrators of torture, all of that is just incredible to think of. But the monetary cost is serious but not fatal.
Hi. I have a question that may seem a little off topic, but I think it pertains to wealth inequality. I was wondering if you could discuss what's behind the run-up in commodity prices lately. Is this another in a series of asset bubbles, or something more fundamental going on that could lead to inflation on the consumer level?
Yeah. All right. Yeah. By the way, I think I can take about two more. It's well, let's see how fast I go. But I think no more people in line, please, because it's there are. I actually have an ailing wife that I need to get back to. So, okay, commodity prices. Okay, in oil first off, but other things as well. Some of it is speculation, although not necessarily irrational speculation. If you think that there's some reasonable chance that Dick Cheney might bomb Iran, then having some oil futures might turn out to be a very, very good bet. And so that really does have the effect of driving up those prices in anticipation. Other commodities, no, there's a real, I think the fundamental point is that the world does have limited resources. There's a theory called peak oil, which is looking increasingly plausible as we look at the oil situation. And world economy is still growing, especially the Chinese are growing and increasing their demand for all of this stuff. So the prices, it is mostly supply and demand. Now, how serious it is? It adds a few tenths of a percentage point to inflation each year. It does crimp real wages. But again, it's in the category of things that are not crippling. Can we still have a huge improvement in the quality of life for most Americans despite rising oil and copper prices? The answer is yes. It's a little bit harder, but not drastically harder. Now, give me that war with Iran and oil at $140 a barrel, and then I start to get worried. But barring that, I think we're not great, but okay on that front.
Hi, Mr. Krugman. I have a question about income inequality, and that's that I have an econ professor who once sent me a report published by the Federal Bank of Dallas.
Oh, yeah, I know that one.
And in it concedes with your point, and that the gap between the poor and the rich are actually getting larger because the rich are getting wealthier, but not because the poor are getting poorer. But it also concludes that, and then it cites a study that's been conducted by the University of Michigan. What they did is they tracked those who lived below the poverty line, who are at the poorest quartile of the poverty line, over time, over, I don't know, 2 decades.
Yeah, and I can describe, a lot of people move up the scale. There's a lot of,
right.
But the Dallas Fed story failed to correct. There are two things. There is some, people do move up. There are, and down. There is income mobility in the United States. So long-term lifetime inequality is less than what you get from a snapshot at a point in time. However, the Dallas Fed study, somehow, one of the really crucial things you need to do is correct for stages of life. So it's not quite as bad, but there's a famous or infamous study that was put out by the Treasury Department during the first Bush's administration that said, people in the bottom quintile have a huge chance of moving up in income. And somebody looked at it, and the people who moved up dramatically were people who had income, who were under the age of 25 when the study started, and were in their late 30s by the time it ended. And as I think it was Larry Katz at Harvard, a labor economist, said, this isn't income mobility. This is the guy who works in the college bookstore and then gets a real job later on. And there's a lot of that in that study. So it's very illusory. The reality is that social mobility in the United States is much less than people imagine. And that intergenerational mobility is much, much less than, and what that means. All right, actually, statistics. The Department of Education conducted a long-term study looking at, they started with a group of students in 8th grade, who took a standardized test, so they had a sense of their ability. And they also looked at the family backgrounds. And what they found was, so far they've only tracked them up through looking at how they did, at their college experience, if they did go to college. Students who were in the top quartile on the test, but in the bottom quartile in terms of family income, were less likely to finish college than students who were in the bottom quartile on the test and top quartile in family income. Basically, if you're a smart kid from a poor family, you have less chance of getting through college than if you're a dumb kid from a well-off family. That's America today. All of the studies I know show that, we talked about Horatio Alger, the American dream. Horatio Alger has moved to Europe. It's actually much harder for people from poor backgrounds to make their way in the United States than in other advanced countries. So, yeah, it's not true. You know, anyone who says that there is no real problem of income inequality because people move up and down, it's not entirely false, but it's mostly false. We really do have a big problem.
Is there a book or an author you recommend on this issue?
Gosh, you can recommend an old paper I wrote myself about all this stuff called The Rich, the Right, and the Facts, which was in the American Prospect in '92. And I think there's it's not, let me recommend Google Scholar. It's Scholar by Google. It's actually very good. It's amazing. It sort of does for the academic literature what Google does for ordinary stuff. So if you want to just if you look at that put in something like income mobility, you'll very quickly find the best studies. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Could you talk a little bit about the politics and the economics of the Social Security Trust Fund, sort of where it came from? Do I understand correctly that back in the 80s, we figured out that there was this demographic bulge coming through the boa constrictor, and that we've been essentially paying for our own retirement in addition to our parents' retirement, but now it's, according to Bush, nothing but a bunch of paper.
Yeah.
How does that play in, and how, because it seems like the taxes we've been paying in extra FICA taxes are in effect making the tax system more regressive, but it's not counted as taxes, so it's not in there. Could you?
Well, it actually is but yeah.
The context of that?
Yeah, in the early 1980s, the people knew that the baby boomers would be retiring starting soon. That wasn't a secret, and that it would be a burden on Social Security, and so a fix was put in. The tax rate, FICA, was increased so that the Social Security system would build up assets to deal with the future retirements. And some other things. There was also a gradual increase in the retirement age for maximum benefits. And it was a commission that recommended the solution. Actually, the Greenspan Commission, headed by you-know-who. And basically it did its job. I mean, there's now, depending upon which estimates you use, the Social Security system is either good into the 2040s or good forever. You can use the more optimistic estimates, good forever. But having done this, and it is a regressive tax increase because you only pay FICA, it's a flat rate up to an income of about 90,000, I guess, 97,000 now. Anyway, but nothing on income beyond that level. Having done that, now all of a sudden, people come, including Mr. Greenspan himself, say, oh, but that trust fund isn't real because it's the Social Security Administration building up the surplus, but it's just part of the government, and the rest of the government is running a deficit, so there's nothing there. Now, it's it's a case of bait and switch on a gigantic scale. I actually wrote a column about Greenspan's role in all of this, and I called it one of the great privileges of being a Times op-ed columnist is you do get to write your own headlines, provided they fit. So my headline on that was actually three-card maestro, incredible outrage. It's sort of a 25-year process of essentially shifting taxes from the wealthy to the working class, and then saying, "Oops, sorry, there was no point in that." I do not think actually they'll get away with it, but it was pretty amazing. Thanks.
Hey, I apologize for being the next question answer. But I know you want to be done by me, but
No, it's fine. I'm happy. I'm just.
but I'll be quick.
Yeah.
Basically, when you talk about who can afford health care, and a lot of people that are against the single payer or other systems for providing universal health care have all talked about those who have health insurance versus those who haven't. And they talk about the incomes at which you can afford health insurance and why don't you buy some and things like that. But people don't see this in the context of the massive crisis of consumer debt and the fact that a greater section of the economy of workers are living at the subsistence level because of the twin squeeze of healthcare costs and consumer debt.
Sure. No, this is look, the S-chip story, where, of course, the smear against Graham Frost and his family, and people saying, well, you know, this family has income of $45,000 a year. Why can't they afford health insurance? Or even you talk about families with $55,000 a year, and then you bear in mind that for a family of four, if you try to get individual insurance, if you try to buy insurance on your own, not through an employer, it's going to cost probably about $14,000 a year right now. And of course, that's after out of after-tax income. This is not affordable for families that are trying to get by, families that have debt, families that have problems. And furthermore, what if you actually have a pre-existing condition, like your kid was in a car accident and has brain damage? It's the whole attempt to claim that people lack health insurance because they're improvident or because they don't care is, it's crazy. It comes from people who have no sense of what it's like. Well, you know, that's someone asked earlier about what do these people think like. And a lot of it is they just have no sense of what it's like for people who don't have the advantages and privileges they have. Yes, so something like well, no, the quintessential remark, I think, was just a few months ago. President Bush saying, I mean, people have access to health care in America. After all, you just go to an emergency room. There lives somebody who has never had an idea of what it's like not to sort of be born into the right family.
You can have health insurance and not be able to afford the income.
That's right. And health insurance, there's good health insurance and bad health insurance. There was a study by, of all places, Reader's Digest, about how many people have inadequate health insurance that will not pay enough of the costs, that can leave you desperately financially exposed if something goes wrong. And so to the 15% of the American people who don't have health insurance, you have to add at least another 25% who don't have adequate health insurance. It's and it's so widespread that, look, you know, I'm a Princeton professor. I know most of the people I know are in pretty good shape. They're upper middle income or better. The extraordinarily high fraction of the people I know are well enough off to get hit by the alternative minimum tax and so on, right? But I know at least a dozen people who either don't have health insurance or are in desperate fear of losing their health insurance, or have had to take jobs they hate and give up jobs they loved in order to get health insurance. This distorts our lives, and it's completely unnecessary. No other advanced country has this problem, and yet we spend, almost twice as much as other on healthcare as other countries that have superb healthcare systems. Which is a crying need for action, but also a tremendous opportunity, because if we can fix this, it will be something that will transform the way Americans think about what we can do to make this a more just society. So I should tell you, New York Times rules do not allow me to endorse candidates. In principle, you don't even know which party I'm going to favor. So, but I think I can give you, say we have a tremendous opportunity now. So next year, vote early and often. Thank you.
You've been listening to economist and author Paul Krugman speaking about his latest book, The Conscience of a Liberal. This program was produced by PDxJustice Media Productions. To find out more about this program and related topics, please visit our website at www.pdxjustice.org. You'll find links to more information about the topics discussed in this program, and you'll find video and audio programs featuring speakers such as David Cole, Susan Faludi, Natalie Angier, Phyllis Bennis, Rashid Khalidi, and many others. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for supporting net neutrality and all forms of grassroots, democratic net neutrality and all forms of grassroots, democratic community media.
Where you're screaming and no one can hear you, which is particularly peculiar when you're writing twice a week on the op-ed page of the New York Times, but even so, it didn't seem like anything was getting through. To some extent, that nightmare has lifted. The acoustics in here are really interesting. It's all right. I'll save. I'm sorry. It is really strange because the echoing. By the way, the best news source truly for these past 7 years has in fact been The Onion, and my favorite of all the Onion stories was the one that explained everything, that basically Dick Cheney had been using the White House intercom system to talk to George Bush, pretending to be the voice of God. And that's what this room is making me think of right now. Sorry. Okay. So let me get back to the theme. All right. Things have lifted some. There's clearly a lot more hope. And actually, this new book, The Conscience of a Liberal, is remarkably optimistic at the end for me. So much so that friends are asking if I'm feeling quite all right. So I'll try to talk about the reasons for that optimism and also the reasons to be really worried about the outlook. But mostly, we have 15 long months of this administration to go. By no means assured that we're going to have. The political system has egged it on. Has, in fact, as I'll explain in a little bit, largely been responsible for the creation of a second Gilded Age. We're supposed to be a democracy. Shouldn't changes in economic trends that hurt most people and benefit only a small number of people evoke a reaction, and not a reaction of approval and encouragement? So those are the two great puzzles, and let me talk first about the economics. So, all right, I'm saying second Gilded Age, and people tend to think, well, that's exaggeration, it's hyperbole, it's a metaphor. It's none of that. And the cold, hard numbers tell you that it's, in fact, not at all an exaggeration. Right now, the inequality of incomes in the United States is approximately as great as it was. Actually, it's almost exactly matches the numbers from the 1920s. And as far as we can tell, the 1920s were not really that different from the 1890s. So, in fact, when we say we're in a second Gilded Age, that's literally true. We are fully back to levels of inequality as great. You can see it, not just in the statistics, but, for example, Greenwich, Connecticut was like the North Shore of Long Island, which is near where I grew up, but Greenwich, Connecticut was one of the great places of robber baron mansions. There were giant mansions in Greenwich, Connecticut built during the Gilded Age. And during the post-war era, many of them were a good administration to follow. But it does seem that we need to look beyond. We need to get past what happened, and we need to figure out where we can be going from here. But in order to understand that, we need to understand how we got here in the first place. So a large part of Conscience of a Liberal is about what brought us to this nightmare that we all felt we were living in for several years, and that turns out that when you look at that history, there are some reasons for guarded optimism, for thinking that we may be able to turn this around, but not necessarily. So before I get to the future, let me tell you what I think we need to know about the past. Now, there are, from my point of view, two great puzzles in what happened to America over the past several decades. One of them is economic. It's the puzzle of why it is that we've come to enter a second Gilded Age. What happened to the middle-class society? I'm a baby boomer. What happened to the middle-class society that baby boomers grew up in? The middle-class society of of post-war America. How is it that inequality has increased as much as it has? And the second puzzle is political. How is it that, far from doing something to mitigate this movement into a second Gilded Age, in fact, converted into nursing homes, basically no one could afford to maintain houses like that in the America I thought I was living in. In recent years, people, mostly hedge fund managers, have been buying up those Gilded Age mansions in Greenwich, and in many cases tearing them down to build bigger mansions. So we are, it really has happened. We really are back to the full Gilded Age. This has some pretty serious consequences. In a way, the least of those consequences, but very important, is that most Americans are not sharing in economic progress, or sharing very little in it. There is a real debate, a complex debate among economists about whether the typical family is better off now than it was in the early 1970s. By some measures, income adjusted for inflation is up a little bit, but that's entirely because more working spouses. So how much of that is a real gain and how much of it is just people working harder? Then you can go through other things. Some things, there were no DVD players in 1973. There were, but on another hand, it was easier to get to feel that your children were getting a decent education in 1973. The inequality in school districts has increased greatly. You can put it around. The answer is not important, actually. Actually, I've got a new list on the list of reasons why you should listen to this guy. Apparently, there's an ad running on Air America that describes me as a new gladiator for the progressive movement. And my wife listened to it and said, "Now you really need to lose some weight." Okay. So. Last time I had a book out, it was largely a collection of columns, and it was written in what I still think of as the darkest days of recent years. It was a period. The book came out in 2003. It was written. The various entries in it were mostly written in 2002 and in 2003, which was I assume for many people in this room, certainly for me, it was a kind of a nightmarish period. One of those nightmares